Hello and good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Miller Ziders with Deep Roots KC, and welcome to the Roundtable Beginning with Native Plants. For this session, don't forget to use the chat feature located in the toolbar below, down on the bottom of your Zoom window. For all of your comments and for your questions, please feel free to add them to the Q&A section found also in the toolbar below. All of your questions for our panelists should be directed down into the Q&A section so we can get them out and asked as fast as possible. Now, I'd like to welcome our speakers to present Beginning with Native Plants. Lydia Gibson is the Director of Corporate Development with Ripple Glass. Matt Bunch is the lead horticulturalist for the Giving Grove and has been a hort professional since 1994. Sarah Beer, whom you may recognize from the introductory series, and the owner and operator of Oak and Low. Robert Vogel Lutung, a retired EPA staff person. Roberta has converted her entire yard to native plants, so it's safe to say she's also a native plant enthusiast. Please welcome all of our wonderful panelists into this Zoom session, and we can get off and running with our roundtable discussion. Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah, Roberta, Lydia, and Matt. I can only say that people are really glad to have you here to answer some of their questions, as you guys are experts in your field. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Miller. I guess I'll go ahead and start. My name is Sarah Beyer. I am with Oak and IO, and hope that many of you have watched the introductory series that we put together. I spent some time on that last winter, and I'm just so excited that it's getting out and reaching people, and I hope that you found it helpful. Of course, with just 5 episodes, there is so much that we couldn't cover, so I'm really glad that you're all here today to ask questions. Miller asked us to just go around and kind of give a little introductory statement so that you guys can kind of get to know a little bit more about who we are and have some time to get your questions into the Q&A. So I think the main thing that I want to start with is just to say that if you're new to this, it can feel really overwhelming. And I think a lot of people feel as they start to access all of the great information that's out there that that you have to do everything, that I have to take out all of my non-native plants and replace them. And I need to replace my entire yard, and I need to leave every single leaf, and I need to, completely change the way that I've been doing things. And we have this culture that has this very normalized view for how our lawns and our yards should look. And so to try to learn more about why that's a problem and what we can do and what we can do differently can feel like, oh my gosh, there's just so much to do. And so I just want to encourage you to start with what feels manageable, and to just know that doesn't have to be an all or nothing situation, and just to, get started and see where it takes you. So we're really happy that you're here.
Thank you, Sarah. Lydia, would you like to give a brief intro for our viewers today?
Yeah, I'm Lydia Gibson, and I currently have a full-time job with Ripple Glass, a glass recycling company in Kansas City, but my background is in all sorts of waste management, including organic waste management. I am just a trashy kind of gal, and my love for composting in the soil really came out of that experience and some of my time working on a farm. So I specialize in all things rotten, and my philosophy is all about compost happens and making it easy. And trying to understand how we can build organic matter in the soil, but in ways that can be not so complicated. There's a wide range of things that we can do, but I like to approach it from the simplest is best perspective.
Great, thank you. Matt, would you like to tell the people what you're all about?
Yeah, certainly. So I currently work with the Giving Grove, which is a community fruit tree organization and part of the Kansas City Community Gardens here in Kansas City. But since 1994, I've been in a number of horticulture positions. So first off kind of working for a garden center, working with all of those cultivars, all of those non-natives. I planted Bradford pears back in the 90s, and shame on me. But at the time, we didn't know that those were invasive or would become invasive. And so I've been spreading the gospel of removing all of those pears that may have been planted back in the 90s, even the 2000s. People are still planting them to this day, unfortunately. But then over the years, I worked at Powell Gardens, the local botanical garden here in Kansas City, and at the Discovery Center, which, as some of you may know, has a great native plant landscape. So you know, that kind of being said, I've planted a lot of things. My yard is, I would say, half native, but also I have a lot of exotic plants in there, but they're exotic plants that don't spread. And just kind of some sort of best advice as you're getting started in on this, that not all plants are going to grow for you, and not all native plants, just because they're native, will actually grow for you. All of the conditions in your yard are going to be very different from one portion of the yard to the next. And so knowing how your yard is composed, sun, shade, mixed light, dry soils, clay soils, wet soils, you'll have to take all of this into account, and you'll need to find the plants that work best for those conditions. So that being said, you know, don't be afraid to experiment with any of this. And there are native plants that will work for your situations. Don't be afraid to create something that nobody else has created, that is pleasing not only to you, but some of the other earthlings that we're kind of helping serve. These are plants for insects, these are plants for birds, and these are plants for us.
Exactly. Thank you, Matt. Roberta, would you like to finish up these introductions? We can jump into some questions.
Yeah, thanks. Good morning. Sarah did such a great job on the videos, and there's a thing in the chat about how to find them if you haven't already watched them. So I'm not going to address the practical stuff so much, more just maybe get a little philosophical. I've been doing it for a long time, and I find that it's a practice that's about a lot more than just gardening. So what I would say is that one of the most important things is when we garden with native plants in small spaces, which most of our yards are, they're not big natural landscapes. We're joining human elements to nature elements, and that's a good thing. And so we want to consider the human elements, you know, the placement of a house or other structures, and think about how humans interact with the space. And at the same time, let natural areas be your guide, because they have a lot to tell you about how things want to grow and how they just show up naturally. So for example, you know, a square meter of prairie is mostly full of sedges and grasses, not so much flowers. So that's a really good example. I think that you're offering a gift when you put ecology first, and it's very countercultural. So kind of lean into that and recognize that it is different, and you're going to have funny feelings, and people around you are going to have funny feelings, and that's okay too. Just kind of let it be, you know, a way to practice with all those things. There's no such thing as an instant garden when you're doing natives, right? You got to kind of cultivate curiosity and patience and kind of letting go of control. I'm still working on that. I'm a big old control freak, you know. And lastly, I just want to say, just be in the process as much as the outcome. Nature knows a lot more than you do, like Matt just said, about what wants to grow in your funny little space that isn't, you know, designed by nature in the first place. It has all kinds of weird things, like the developer removing the topsoil and whatever else is happening in your yard. So, you know, just know that it's a process and it takes time, and it's all good. You don't have to worry about failure. So that's my advice for today.
Thank you so much. And thank you again to all of you for joining as panelists today. It's just a wonderful experience for everyone involved to get to meet, convene, speak, get their questions answered, and for me to get to speak with experts in fields like you. And each of you kind of hinted on a really great aspect of, not just the native plants part of it, but just the ecology. Being connected with nature is such a huge thing. And understanding how we humans and people act in our environments and in our own spaces, but also, how we impact these larger processes is vital to understanding how we make better decisions about gardening, using waste, reusing waste, and just being better people in general. So thank you. We have one question from Stan in Kansas City, Missouri. Are there any city ordinances that guide or limit what we can or cannot do? I don't know if that is specified towards waste or gardening, but let's do both. Are there any ordinances that may limit you on plantings with certain plants, or are there any ordinances that limit capabilities for composting, etc., that you guys know of?
I can take that if you'd like. I'm working on a committee that's working on changing the landscape code in Kansas City, Missouri. My yard has been cut down and I've also been cited recently. So I have some experience in this area. And I would say that Kansas City, Missouri's code is just very gray. So, as long as it's kind of a managed landscape, it's supposed to be okay, but then the code enforcement officers might not know what they're looking at. So it gets kind of gray. But I would say that it is time, and it will happen, that we will have new codes that are much more inviting to native landscape without the hassle. And so I wouldn't worry too much about codes, except I would worry more about being neighborly and thinking about, do you really want a 10-foot tall sunflower, hanging over your sidewalk or your neighbor's space versus, picking that in the back corner of the lot or something like that. So there was another part of that question that I'm forgetting. Was there more to it than just the code? There was something else I was going to say.
Maybe limitations that you might.
Oh, I know. It was there's some areas have HOAs and they could be quite restrictive. And so I visited a garden this weekend where a woman made sure she was moving into a neighborhood that didn't have an HOA, but she backs up to an HOA. So that's something to pay attention to. I personally would never live in a place that had an HOA that told me what to do with my yard, but many people do. And so that's something to think about. I don't know how flexible they're becoming, but I know some of them can be quite restrictive, especially about even things like composting.
Interesting. Oh, sorry, Lydia, go ahead.
No, I was just going to broaden and answer that question on composting. I think that point that Roberta makes on HOAs is absolutely relevant, but that's also a place where you can engage. Those are things that are not set in stone. They are not city code, and even city code can change. And so with a fair amount of engagement with the folks and the leadership of those organizations, that's something that you can shift. Generally, there are not restrictions on composting, but again, I would echo Roberta's comments on being neighborly. Like, don't place a pile of rotting produce right next to your neighbor's fence to create rodent problems. It's just about being a good neighbor and managing that in a way that's a part of the community.
Great. And in your experience, is there, I'm 23, so I'm not fully understanding of the implications and applications of HOAs, but do they derive most of their codes or ordinances from city and local ordinances, or are they essentially their own agency that is free to create their own rules and rule sets?
The latter. It's an add-on on top of whatever is existing. And that applies not just to Kansas City, Missouri, but in communities across the nation. I'm not so sure. I saw we had somebody from Ontario, Canada. I'm not sure the kind of structures and civic structures to our neighbors up north, but it's a pretty common second layer of administration that communities and neighborhoods form to control pretty specific things that can involve, like the landscaping
I would add to that that your HOA is, if you have one, is comprised of your neighbors. So they're people who live in your neighborhood. It ideally is not, and they run the gamut. But ideally, they are people that you can engage with that do live nearby, that you can, reach out and talk to one-on-one, and generally are like volunteers from the neighborhood. So getting involved in whatever subcommittee signs off on landscaping or looks at landscaping may be a way to influence those. So I would also second what Roberta said, is to, if you are looking to move in somewhere and you know that native landscaping is important to you, if possible, to look for places that either don't have HOAs, or sometimes a very old HOA, if the neighborhood was built quite some time ago, may have something that is not really actively involved in nitpicking the day-to-day and what you're, what's parked in your driveway when, and all of those sorts of things. And newer neighborhoods are much more likely to be concerned with keeping things very consistent and looking just the way they were when everything was built. So it's one thing to kind of keep in mind that may be able to help you find an HOA situation that either is influenceable or is not super involved to begin with.
Wonderful. And Stan follows that his original question up with, I guess, piggybacking off what you were speaking on, Sarah. Where would he be able to find a list of neighborhoods with HOAs or HOA documents? Is there some sort of formal, maybe database or collection, like site or area where they can kind of collectivize, or is it just an HOA can choose to have a website, or you kind of just have to go around through your own independent research?
I think that I would say in Kansas City, Missouri, getting in contact with the city planning department, I think there is a list of HOAs that does exist. That's usually also attached to your property data. So if you're looking on a parcel search, it will say which neighborhood that particular parcel or house is in, and that will usually connect up with any associated HOA. So I think, yeah, the neighborhoods, Kristen, thanks for that comment. The neighborhoods division has a list of those. And it may not be, as simple as, you get a comprehensive list, and this is where you go and look and see what each individual set of, rules and bylaws are in each organization. It takes a little bit of investigation. So I think, instead of doing a broad search, if you've got a particular property or area you want to look into, go into the parcel data, contact the neighborhood division at Kansas City, Missouri's City Hall, and do due diligence. Like if you're working with a realtor, have them work with that. That would be my advice as you kind of narrow in on the search. I think it'd be a lot more difficult to try to throw a dart at the map and try to figure out this is a spot that does not have an HOA. Look at the other things that are important to you and then investigate that as you go down the road.
Okay, great. Yeah, Stan says thank you. So that's answered all of his questions. And it brings up an interesting point. When we think about topics like climate change and renativizing landscapes or areas, even regions, how big of a role do you believe that the HOA part of the United States plays a role in that collectivizing action and having a collective impact? Anyone's open to answer this one. Just kind of a general question.
Yeah. I mean, I see them more as a reflection of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like a big system. There's lots of elements that have created a situation that normalize things like lawns and things that don't necessarily contribute ecologically. And there's a long history there. So I just see it as one element of that system. And that does definitely reinforce it in many places. So, yeah.
Or you can go ahead, Lydia. I don't know.
I would just say that's a big old depends.
Yeah. We have another question. Stacia asks, what is the best way to amend soil if you are trying to replace turf grass with natives?
I'll jump in on this one. It kind of depends on what you're starting with. I'll use an example just from my own experience, in where I had a massive disturbance in my front yard. And so I literally had soil that was 6-7 feet deep upturned to the top of my structure. So it was completely a moonscape. It was clay 6 feet down. So starting from an absolute scratch perspective, I actually was the only probably scenario where I would like till the living bejesus out of something, but I absolutely did to try to break up some of those structures and those clays. So I did some massive tilling operation and then incorporated a lot of compost and tilled that in to kind of try to recreate some organic matter in that structure. And then I was able to go in and layer on top of that. If you're replacing existing turf grass, and that also depends on what it was laid down on. So a lot of times, mostly if you're in a newer subdivision, that soil has been disturbed, it's been compacted. It was like my front yard where you had heavy machinery on it. So if you've got the opportunity to amend with compost, that's fantastic. If you don't, using things that you've got, leaves, grass, and letting those decompose or incorporating those into the soil. There's also some techniques in terms of using solarization to kill out existing grass, where you can either use black tarps, almost anything that creates that kind of that barrier to kind of squash the growth and kind of start to kill off what you've got. And even that killed off grass will start to incorporate and help change. And it's also going to depend on what you're trying to plant. What is the native like? I think that you think about what environment you want to establish for whatever friend you're trying to bring into that new space. So that's, again, a lot of depends on those situations. I'm always going to default as a lever if compost is a really quick additive. But if you're looking at things that may be preferring different soil conditions, different pH conditions, I think matching the type of planting that you want to do to what approach you take to the soil is the best way to go.
I kind of want to jump in here a little bit too, because this is a big depends, and it's almost a little bit of a can of worms that we can really open up here. Because in some cases, so let's say you're going from just turf to a bed situation where you're going to be growing natives. In some cases, you may just want to take a sod cutter and remove all of that sod. Then afterwards, you take an aerator and you actually aerate the soil down in there so you can get a little bit of oxygen transference. You wouldn't want to till up too much. And the reason I say some of this is because tilling will invite all of these new weeds to start to germinate. And then the gardening becomes that much more difficult because you have so many new weeds. But you do need to decompact your soil at the same point in time. And that's where the aeration, just getting a core aerator in, will really help with that water percolation and that oxygen transference in the soil. And then, of course, adding some good compost will help boost that organic material too.
And I'll add, I love the aeration idea, and that doesn't even have to be one of those big fancy machines. That can be just taking your pitchfork, and just kind of poking at it, giving it. There's a lot of ways that you can do to kind of start to loosen and break up that structure. But great point, Matt, about I would hazard tilling unless you are literally on a moonscape scenario where you've gotten just a construction site or a bare ground situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've also had luck using cover crops, and particularly when there was a lot of compaction. Two situations. One, just from machinery used to do paths and rain gardens, using oilseed radishes, so those big daikon radishes, and just letting them rot in place for a couple of seasons. That really helped. And then that's a form of aeration and adding organic matter at the same time. And also under a maple tree, which was very compacted and had lawn, it wasn't ready for planting at all. And I just, you can't put too much compost under a tree at once because it'll kill it, it'll suffocate it. But I just did like a couple inches at a time each year and added the leaves from the neighbors also. And did that, I think, 3 years in a row. And then I could get a shovel in there, hand shovel, you know, good 6-8 inches and plant dry native species. So it worked out pretty well.
Great. And that leads into next question, which is what are the best starter plants for beginners? Are there any that are better than others in different landscapes that may bode well? There's a lot of factors at play within that question.
Yeah,
but there are
this,
easier plants to cultivate that don't require as much inputs.
right. Well, yeah. So this definitely, yeah. This question can run the whole gamut of many different species of native plants. But I would say initially, if you want something that will give you flowers, will bring in insects, bring in pollinators, bring in beneficials, bring in butterflies, bring in birds. I would say, you know, any of the echinacea species that are native, the purpurea or the pallida are great. Asters like the New England aster, even though it can be weedy, and the aromatic aster are also kind of very easy, low care, great bang for your buck. Know that they will germinate freely if you have the proper conditions. So maybe not have them at the front of the garden, but have them more at the back of the garden. But those are, I would say, those are both high impact, very easy to grow plants right there. Liatris is another one. Any of the Liatris species are also going to be high impact, easy to grow.
Okay, great.
I would add to that, I think beginners often are really interested in the floral display and the things that those can attract, but I think sedges and grasses are really underrated, especially for beginners, just because they maybe don't seem as sexy on the surface, but they really can add a lot to both the ease of your maintenance and the overall appearance of the garden, and do things like Sydney says sedges are the sexiest. Yeah, I love them. And can do things like help to along the edges of a planting, can give a more like neat, orderly appearance depending on what you have, you know, growing behind them. So a sedge or a grass appropriate to your site, and we'll take a little bit of research, but I would add that to my beginners list, I think.
Great. And when we're thinking about those, Matt and Sarah, like you were speaking on the grasses and the sedges versus those floral displays and the flowers, what are the pros and cons of spring versus fall plantings? I know that there's better times for each respectively, but could you give some more input or your insight into, are there better times within the spring and fall for grasses and flowers?
Well, so in general, and this is for just both grasses and flowers, in general, anytime in the spring, let's say from March until May, sometimes even June. However, if we get dry, some of these things take a little while to get established. And then I think September is a wonderful time to get a lot of these native perennials in. You know, the thing you have to worry about with grasses, especially warm season grasses, is they start to shut down early. So they're going into fall. The sap is if we could use the word sap, the water is starting to actually go down into the root system by August and into September. So transplanting them too late into the fall, they will have a very low survivability rate. So with most of your native grasses, you're going to be better off. You have a bigger window to plant in the spring as opposed to in the fall.
Okay.
And then,
In terms of seasonal, sorry, Matt, go ahead.
oh, well, and we haven't even touched on trees and shrubs, which is also that native realm. And trees and shrubs, native trees and shrubs, you can plant October, November, and in some cases in December with them. Go ahead, Lydia.
And I'm going to jump in on a seasonality note in terms of soil amendments. There's a couple other questions in the chat, and I'm seeing those. Amendments definitely should happen on an annual basis if you can do it. If not, no big deal. There's life in the soil anyway. But I highly recommend, if folks are thinking about doing sort of composting soil amendments or adding compost, do so in the fall. Oftentimes a compost still may have an active biological process ongoing, which will take up a little bit of nitrogen as things finish breaking down. So you can experience some tie up of that nitrogen in the process. So the food that you're trying to give to the plants may be dedicated towards finishing up the process of composting. So if you've got the opportunity to do your application of your soil amendments like compost in the fall, I highly recommend it.
Okay, great. And
I also like that it gives the compost time to actually incorporate into the soil better through the freeze thaw mechanisms that happen in the winter time. That compost actively sinks into the soil during that time.
And fun fact, the time when your soil is actually the most active is after that first snowfall, creating that blanket. That is like the peak activity in the soil and life, because you've got the most decomposing matter being available, and then you've got that moisture. So it's really, fall into wintertime is actually, I think, counterintuitive to a lot of what folks think. That is the time to really focus on your soil for your next season.
interesting. And with speaking on compost and soil, is there I had an individual ask me, they laid compost and then they had a bunch of mushrooms pop up. I'm assuming that that's due to the soil being a little bit healthier. They were concerned. They were wondering if they should remove the mushrooms, if that's a sign that their soil is unhealthy. I'm assuming that that's incorrect, right? That their soil is actually doing a pretty good job of.
Yeah, that just means they're a fungus, and some fungal spores are a little bit more attractive and friendly than others. But that just means there's enough food and that the spores are present. I think you'd be more concerned if there wasn't fungus.
Great. Our next question is, reflecting on your experiences, what did you do right and what did you do wrong in the early days of your transition to a native yard? Roberta, I believe you could answer that question best. Did you feel like there were any glaring mistakes or glories that you had whenever you were going through that transition?
You know, it's hard to think of it that way. I think, I guess for me, I'm a bit of an all or nothing person, and I probably, I did the whole yard, the first time. It's a much smaller yard than I have now, but I probably would have stepped it a little bit more, and I'm glad I'm doing it now. I have more time because I'm semi-retired. But I can't think of too many like big planting errors, although I have to say, plants go away, plants move around, and that's kind of normal. And every fiber of our being can sometimes be pretty mad about that because you work really hard to create a certain design. And then, especially in a year like this, when it was such an intense summer, I know I was traveling all summer and wasn't there to baby anything. And like whole species across the garden disappeared. And that's part of what happens. And then they come back, but maybe not where you planted them. Some of you have more experience in formal spaces, might have something to say about this. Matt.
Yeah, so I would say as far as, because I would say I've made mistakes in planting. There are some plants that I introduced too early into a landscape. For example, we'll say river oats. River oats is one of those plants where almost every one of the seeds will actually germinate, and while that can be a good thing in certain situations, it's not a good thing in a small landscape situation. I know I still fight the plant in my own personal yard, but in larger landscapes, it's just fine. I think knowing what a plant's capacity is to reseed is incredibly important, and knowing where it happily does so. I would say when you go all or nothing, that definitely will happen. Now, if you do things more gradually and do this over a multiple year time period, you'll see where plants really are at their happiest, and you'll kind of go with that in your landscape. So yeah, and I guess the other thing is, as you continue on this journey, knowing all stages of the plant is very important. While most of you on this call are maybe just getting started in this, but you'll want to know what your plant looks like as it's emerging in early March, early April. You'll want to know, oh, it grows 18 inches in 2 weeks this time of year. What does that mean? So follow this, and sometimes we're just casual observers of the landscape, but become a more active observer, and then you'll know how these plants behave a little bit better.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, both of you. Our next question comes from Nan. Are there any native plants that are your go-to plant, or some of your favorites that you would recommend for specific situations such as sun, shade, wet, or dry spaces?
I'll take that as far as some of the wet spaces. Always go to, I would say swamp milkweed is one of those that I will always go to. I will always go to buttonbush if in a wet space, if the site allows enough room for a buttonbush. So wet spaces, I feel like there's a really nice palette of plants in rain gardens, sometimes using lizard's tail. I've had lizard's tail around for 15 years in my yard now, and it's a rain garden that goes dry, but it still survives. So yeah, this is a very big question, because you're asking dry, you're asking wet, you're asking shade, you're asking sun. I've taken wet. Who wants to take dry or sun or? Or I could take more.
Or maybe that connects well. Stan also commented, what are a book or website resources that are most helpful in your native plant research and planting? Maybe in the direction of where to go to get answers to each one of these questions.
Yeah, it's a big question, and there's also just a lot of, I'm sure you guys know, a lot of really great resources, whether it's websites, books, webinars, videos, but different sources of data that you can tap into. Do you guys have any go-to areas of research?
Yeah, for sure. So I know that in the Deep Roots archive of all of the webinars over the last couple of years, there are several that really delve into like favorite plants for sun, favorite plants for shade, and then within those cover all of the other minutia of soil moisture and microclimate type adaptations. So I think that I think there are 3 of them that are great resources. I am a big fan of a lot of our local nurseries have developed really great searchable databases. I mean, it will only give you what they sell. So it's important to kind of look around and to be aware that that's not, the entire palette of native plants that may be available to you. But I do find those helpful as well in terms of searching for, for a particular spot and just getting new ideas about things that you may not have considered before.
I'd also toss
Yeah.
on extension
Go
research.
ahead.
While there's a lot more focus on kind of your traditional gardening and a lot of like the Master Gardener extension programs, I think there's been a lot more broadening of perspective there. So don't hesitate, whether you're in the Kansas City metro or elsewhere, to reach out to your local extension office.
I was going to say that some of I love using some of the plant catalogs, like Missouri Wildflowers, that does a good job of naming, the benefits of the plant and the conditions it needs. Also, some of the growers that do more large scale landscape work where they grow like 10,000s of things, like Taylor Creek, for example, like the Taylor Creek Restoration Nurseries guide has fantastic matrices in their in that booklet that are very specific about growing conditions, and also the native growing conditions of a place, and that's really helpful. Salt tolerance, things like that are really helpful to know. So I found that over the years the online databases have become so good that I almost use them more than any of my books. The books help inspire me with the pictures, but the databases are really helpful. And like Prairie Moon Nursery has great germination guides as an example. So just have to kind of look around a bit. But the Deep Roots, Community Grow Native database, the MOBOT database, those are all really good.
Great, thank you guys so much. Our next question, what are the differences among sedges, grasses, and turf lawns? Are there any distinct differences that would be found in the native sedges and grasses compared to turf lawns? I know that carbon sequestration, water infiltration, most everything has a difference, but are there any differences that people may not be thinking about that want to get into these native plantings that make a big difference in someone's lawn?
Sure. So our native grasses are going to be very different from what you're expecting, or from what you're used to seeing for a turf lawn. So if your mental image of grass is the green carpet, then you're looking for something very different when you're looking for native grasses. So our native grasses tend to be clump forming. They're think of a bunch with with the grass coming out. The technical botanical differences between grasses and sedges, somebody else would probably be able to explain better than I would. I'm looking at Matt here probably on that one, but in terms of what you are visually expecting, we're thinking more of kind of clump forming and generally taller than you would expect in a turf grass lawn. And then in general, as you alluded to, Miller, with our native plants, the root penetration down into the soil tends to be so much deeper that the water and nutrients are able to filter down into the soil and help to support that planting, versus in a turf grass situation. It's not all that much different in terms of nutrient and water and air absorption than your driveway is. So really looking at something that helps to support that basis for the ecosystem in your yard.
I'll
And
jump in
don't
and then
forget-
I'll actually, maybe you'll beat me to it, Roberta, because you have a little bit of a sedge meadow lawn, don't you? So you can speak to some of this. Or here, I will
Go
take,
ahead.
I'll take a little bit about, another popular turf alternative has been buffalo grass, and people well utilize that and can utilize it fairly well. However, buffalo grass is a warm season grass, and most of the sort of turf grasses that we're familiar with that is in everybody's lawn is kind of a mix between a warm season and cool season grass. So these are grasses that give you that appearance of green throughout the year. Buffalo grass is you're having to sort of retrain your brain to think that, okay, this is going to be brown for basically a good 6 months of the year, maybe 7 months of the year, and then it'll green up throughout the summer. But sometimes with some of these native turf alternatives, it's also a reschooling of maintenance on it a little bit too. So knowing when you can mow, so you're not going to promote, let's say, cool season weeds or something like that. So it's something where a lot of the turf professionals also need to understand how to manage some of these native lawn alternatives. And with that, Roberta, I'll kind of turn it over to you with your sedge meadow.
Yeah, well, I wanted to say that don't forget that the seed heads of the sedges and native sedges and grasses are feeding wildlife as well. Now, I had a sedge lawn and I removed it a couple of weeks ago, and I'm replacing it with a different sedge only because the sedge I chose was probably the wrong choice. But it's quite beautiful and it was pretty easy to do, and quote, low maintenance. There's not much you have to do once it's established. But code still hasn't quite figured out that it's not a grass and it's okay if it's 12 inches tall, but that'll change with time. So I don't have a lot of like deep knowledge about the specific botany, but I can say that it's become quite a new trend to think about sedges, particularly as green mulches. Like this is a really dry year. I have a berm in the front of my yard that kind of separates the semi-formal from the more wild spaces. It's going to get quite dry. And I've been establishing Pennsylvanica on there, and it's going to hold a lot more moisture because of that. It's one example. And then the grasses themselves, they hold up those liatris that want to lay down. So they're beautiful, they're functional, and they're just part of a natural landscape. So
That's awesome. And going from Matt and Roberta, you both hinted on that buffalo grass and the more general transitioning from turf grass. One of our questions is pertaining to, are there any natives that serve the same purpose of turf grass, like foot traffic, open play space? Are there similar ones that kind of harbor those same possibilities within what a turf lawn would maybe offer?
I think buffalo grass would be the most durable if somebody were to want kind of the same effect and the same durability. I think of some of the what a lot of golf courses do in drier areas, where they end up putting in something like zoysia or Bermuda grass, which don't get me started on Bermuda grass, but buffalo grass does have that same durability and can be utilized in much the same way, because it is a creeping grass too, as opposed to a bunch forming grass or a clump forming grass. It does have nice full coverage.
Okay, wonderful. And would you, thinking about ground covers, do they have a similar effect? Is there a mix between these grasses that you can put with ground cover that might be able to offer some of those same possibilities while not having to convert your entire lawn to violets?
That's a great idea, actually. No, so one of the things with our native ground or our native like lawn alternative plants is as Matt alluded to, the durability, and you do get that with buffalo grass, but it has, as all plants do, its specific conditions that it likes to grow in, and if those don't exist in the space where you want to have a durable, low growing, low maintenance, then you can be in sort of a tough spot for finding something that is actually native for that spot. And that may be a place where you choose to have some lawn if it's important to you that that it can handle a lot of foot traffic, and and it's not appropriate for buffalo grass. And we used to, I think, say that Kansas City tended to be too wet for buffalo grass. I don't know that this year has borne that out. That it's just it's more difficult to keep it going. It does like to be dry. So that said, there's a lot of combinations of low growing, particularly some of our spring bloomers that stay really low to the ground. The Paccara species or your ground cells can be, the flower comes up about 12 inches tall, and then you can set the mower high and run over those or cut them or allow them to spread, whatever you should choose there. And the remainder is nearly evergreen, stays really short. You can do a combination of those for more shady areas. But you have some options. If you also need it to be like a place where the kids can play rough and the dogs can run around, it's probably not going to work too well.
Okay. How should we go about converting a turf lawn to buffalo grass? I feel like there's some overlap when converting a turf lawn to a wide variety of different options, but specifically for buffalo grass, are there any components or processes that homeowners should specifically look out for when converting with buffalo grass in mind?
I think first off, make sure your conditions are right for buffalo grass. So buffalo grass thrives in full sun. However, if you start to get a little bit of shade, then it'll start to burn out, or it won't get the sun to photosynthesize. So making sure you have full sun and you have dry conditions. Now, that being said, there's still that establishment phase that needs to happen. So I think some of the best plantings I've seen of buffalo grass where it really gets established, it is a mixture of both plugs and seed. So the plugs will get planted, and this is going to be more kind of late April to all throughout May. The buffalo grass is just starting to green up at that point in time. So you would do a mixture of plug and seed. But making sure you have the right sun conditions and making sure that soil is well drained, that's first off.
Okay, great. And Stan asks, I believe we may have answered this earlier briefly. Are there books or website resources that you guys find most helpful in your native plant research and planting?
Well, I think we talked about some of the online resources. I have a lot of books just because I'm crazy about them, but I have found that just to get going, the Department of Conservation has some really nice, kind of tried and true plant books, things that are really easy to find and are really successful, a good place to start, but you could go on forever. There's so many out there.
Yeah, and Stan, I believe if you go through the speaker list, I think Rick Dark, There's plenty of authors and speakers that we have that have just absolutely wonderful resources for not only beginners and different plant types and what do well in different areas, but just everything about native plantings in general.
Alan Brandhagen is one of those speakers and has a great book, Native Plants of the Midwest, if that applies to where you are, which is an excellent one to just flip through. He goes, you know, species by species, has wonderful pictures, and it's a great one for getting inspiration. I would add to the resources something that Roberta alluded to earlier, that both local, you know, well-maintained natural spaces and local gardens that heavily use natives. So whatever those resources may be for you in Kansas City, checking out the Kansas City Wildlands site has a list of really great places to walk around and get inspiration. And of course, the Discovery Center near the plaza in Kansas City is an excellent resource to walk around at all the various times of year and get ideas, and things are well labeled, or there's folks around who can help you identify what you're looking at and whether it would be appropriate for your space.
Sweet. And we're getting a little close with time, but we have a couple more questions left from Deborah. She says, I am in an urban setting, so growing natives in container pots along the sidewalks. How should I amend the soil in these container pots? Second question, would you expect that I need to amend the soil in the pots every year?
I added a little bit of additional detail on some of the compost questions in the chat, so check that out. A couple extra answers there. Yes, you're having an enclosed artificial ecosystem. You've got to be able to keep adding that organic matter that would naturally be in that soil if it was attached to the rest of the world. Thinking about the specific needs of your plant, whether you need to do some pH modification, depending on what you use to put that plant into and what kind of potting mix or kind of substrate you use. But yes, put it on your agenda. Think about what plants you've got in there and what they like and what they need, and provide it for them. And do it on a regular basis, because you are in charge. That is an isolated environment. It's like a fish tank. You are in charge of the fish tank.
Great. Steve asks, what natives grow well under oak trees? I don't want to have any grass under there. And his second question, can you give us an idea how much compost should be added to a 1,000 square foot area? So we can start with any natives that you guys might know of that grow well under oak trees in a more shaded environment, specifically for not either converting from turf grass or trying to outcompete the grass that's under there.
Well, I would say a number of the sedges would work. So the Pennsylvania sedge would actually work for you. Of course, violets will work. Some of the packeras, the roundleaf groundsel. I would go with Bradbury's Monarda too. It'll get a little maybe shin high at its happiest, but I think that's a good height. And if you have, let's say, a little bit of a wetter area beneath the oak, although it's not necessary to have the wet area, but some of the wild ginger. So let's say you're maybe transitioning from the drip line of the oak out into the yard a little bit more, a low spot, plant your wild ginger there. Some of the ephemerals like bluebells might also work as well. And then the compost question, I'd have to do the math in my head because it depends on how deep you would like it too. Maybe Lydia, are you doing the math there?
Yeah, so I am not doing the math because it depends on the depth. That's the question. So you're just basically doing a volumetric calculation. If you're in the Kansas City area, I'll give you a cheater's trick. Missouri Organic has a great calculator on their website that'll give you the conversion into cubic yards, which is usually if you're in a large space, what you're going to be purchasing that material in is a volumetric thing.
Wonderful. And one last question before we hop off of here and start to close out. Roberta, you answered a couple questions in the Q&A that were pertaining to sourcing natives that are regional, sourcing natives and getting their information on it. How important is it from a climate perspective to source natives that have a specific local genotype? Are there any benefits from getting a Liatris species that has a genotype in Kansas compared to Texas and planting it in Kansas?
That's another really big question. And I would say, with my limited expertise and understanding on this, I think we always want to err on the side of what we know. And what we know is that the plants that are local to our area have a genetic makeup that has evolved in this area. And so if we, are looking for a plant and find it in Tennessee, that's been collected from, seed in Tennessee and cultivated, it might be fine, but we don't really know that. And so I think it depends on your purpose. If you are, attempting a prairie reconstruction, then I think you're going to want to be a lot more picky, maybe about where your seeds come from, than you might in your garden. But and again, it's up to your personal preference. There are some folks that won't, plant anything that maybe would not have grown on their home's site, pre-colonization. And then others who are going to draw, I'll plant things that are native to here in the Kansas City area where we kind of straddle, native to Kansas or Missouri, or I may want to stick to things that are native to, the broader Midwest area. And so I think you can really get into the weeds, but I think it's important to understand why that is something that may be important, and then, to make your own most educated decisions from there with your purpose in mind.
Yeah, I think this also holds true for the trees and shrubs too, and I think of so I live over kind of in the Waldo Brookside neighborhood of Kansas City, and I drive down Rock Hill Road that has sweet gums that line the street, and these sweet gums were actually sourced from a southern source. And because of that, they don't drop their leaves until incredibly late in the year. And that actually ends up affecting the trees through broken branches and things like that you normally wouldn't think about. So things like ecotype of all of your plants do matter. However, are we there as a profession yet to where all of the plants we can actually source are ecotype? There are some suppliers that are able to accomplish that, but as a growing profession, the green industry, we're not there yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, think about too, insects and plants co-evolved. And so there's issues around this relates to nativars, how well an insect that's supposed to use a plant can use it. And that's being researched, and it's controversial, and you'd have to dig into it. But also think about how there's a timing about, like that Matt just mentioned, a plant that is grown, several states away may have a very different sense of timing and not bloom at the right time or whatever. So that's something else to consider.
Wonderful. Well, we're a little over time, so I'm gonna start closing out, but I want to say thank you so much to each of you for joining us, answering everyone's questions, and just getting an opportunity to hear from experts, get some insider input is invaluable, and I know I appreciate it a lot. So thank you very much, everybody in chat. From virtually, hands up, applaud for our panelists today. Thank you so much for joining us. For the viewers, please take a moment to fill out the session evaluation. Let us know what you thought about our very first roundtable for this virtual conference. Our next sessions are starting at noon. While you wait, please visit the exhibitor chats or check out our generous sponsors. Go through the Planet Native program, learn as much as you can, and for the next roundtable, have all those wonderful questions prepared. And if you have more questions for Matt, Roberta, Sarah, or Lydia, go ahead and send them in to our Planet Native avenues on the website. You can get those questions in. You can send them into the emails provided. So thank you so much. And if you want to listen to this session again, it is recorded and it will be up for an entire year for you wonderful registrants. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Matt, Sarah, Lydia, Roberta, thank you so much.
Thank you.